I've recently qualified as a train driver after a year of training and heard a few stories from other drivers and my own time in the industry that stuck with me. 1. One driver had a jumper that ended up partially in the cab with him. 2. Someone ended up pretty much decapitated after getting into a driver's compartment that had a drop window and sticking their head out of it. 3. Before coming over, I worked in stations. One of the stations had 3 fatalities in 2 weeks. Someone who was jumping over the tracks to change platform when an empty service ran through. And the one that really sticks with me, a mum who walked off the platform into the path of a fast train whilst holding her baby. Not so much strange creepy, but we have third rail here, a live rail carrying 750 DC on the ground that trains pull from to run, and if a badger brushes against it, it gets a bit of a zap. The badger will then turn around and bite down on its attacker, third rail, and electrocute itself. As soon as its jaws close on the rail, the DC keeps it clamped on. I was told this story by my dad, and sorry, the story was almost 30 years ago, so the details are fuzzy. My dad was a motorman, engineer, for the Chicago Transit Authority. He came home very late one day, which was unusual, and at dinner told me and my mom that some guy was down on the tracks dancing on the third rail, the electrified rail. And this guy, due to being on the tracks, forced my dad to stop his train. While stopped and waiting for the cops, since my dad already called it into dispatch, the guy was just waltzing around dancing on the third rail in front of my dad's train. Eventually authorities got the guy, but if he'd made proper contact with the third rail, the guy would have been super dead. Fun fact, my dad radioed in the downtown flood back in the late 80s, early 90s. This flood is on one of the Modern Marvel's Engineering Disasters episodes. When I was a student engineer, I was coming on the final stretch of our night local. Earlier that night, I was talking with my crew about what to do if we hit someone or had a near miss. The stretch of track we run on has one of the highest fatality rates, and I know that each person on that crew had at least 10 kills. Well, the early morning sun was just starting to come up, and we came around a corner in town to see a garbage bag laying on the rail about 100 feet after the crossing. My conductor makes a joke about how I better not hit the trash. I start whistle sequence, and as I do my final horn, I see that garbage bag move and look up. It was a guy, sitting on the rail in all black, waiting to kill himself. I dump it and just stare at this guy as we barrel down on him, and the whole time he just stares right back at me. When he disappeared in front of the nose of the engine, it felt like an eternity. I actually thought he jumped out of the way, until I heard him hit the cattle guard. Died in the hospital later that day. When I was around 16, my friends and I were by the train tracks in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago. These weren't tracks for the CTA, but for like freight trains, and was easily accessible from the street. We were there because a buddy of ours was doing a summer photography class for Columbia College and wanted to take cool pictures by the tracks. As we were walking along and he's snapping pictures, my friend Manny noticed a black dildo next to the tracks. We burst into laughter, starting to come up with theories as to how exactly it got there, and then like the stupid kids we were, we start kicking it at each other. We were so caught up in avoid being hit by it, we didn't notice the cop car rolling up on us until he gave a quick whoop of the siren. He asked us what we were doing there, and we told him our friends were shooting pictures for a photography project. He asks us for our IDs, but we're all under 18, so all we had were our high school IDs. He takes them back to his car and runs our names, and then comes back and tells us we need to leave because we're not allowed to be there. We didn't really know we couldn't because, like I said, it was so easily accessible from the street, and we didn't see any signs saying not to enter. He followed us in his car until we were off the property and then left. On the way back to my friend's house, we started laughing at what the cop must have thought. He never mentioned the dildo, but we're sure he saw it, and I bet he thought we were doing some sort of really weird photography project. was boarding a train with my dad at King's Cross Station in Sydney, Australia. The platform was underground. It was peak hour. Platform was packed. The train arrives, quickly filled up. As is customary on inner-city trains, the carriage is filled to capacity in minutes, with lots of shoving and little space for bodies near the door. An Asian woman attempts to leave the carriage in the crush, right as the doors are closing. She's trying to push her way out and comes through just as the doors close, on her backpack. She is outside the train. Her backpack is in. She's pinned outside the train by the straps of her backpack, her legs kicking furiously, screaming. The passengers inside are yelling, trying to free her bag and open the electric doors. My father and I are next to the emergency brake button, which he is pressing to activate, but nothing is happening. The train is gaining momentum, and the end of the platform is quickly approaching. The end of the platform is walled in, and the next section of train line is a tunnel, the gap between the train and tunnel being only a few centimeters. In the last few meters before she was torn in half between the train and the wall, the passengers managed to rip the doors open with the train moving and release her, where she fell from the sire of the train down onto the platform just short of the wall. The train continued on. As the doors slammed shut again, we just left her there in a pile on the floor, and the surreal emergency was over. TLDR, woman stuck when train doors shut on her backpack and dragged her along the platform, nearly cutting her in half. The emergency override failed completely. Passengers pulled the doors open and freed her moments before the platform turned into a wall. Not an operator, but I worked track maintenance. Our work train had just pulled out of the track next to us while we were working nights one night, so I just decided to stroll down the track alongside where our machines were working. It was a rough town, so you always expect junk and booze along the tracks. Figuring I had enough light between the machines, I went without my headlamp and walked past this lone boot dead center of the track. I remember thinking to myself, some poor homeless guy out there is stumbling around, bootless. Well, as it turns out, not too much farther down the track, our lead machine calls out for a civilian next to our track. After a second or two, you hear his voice go cold, and we decided to walk up and investigate. Turns out some drunk had been crawling under the work train as it pulled out, dragging and mangling his body pretty badly. His top half was separated. On the lower half, one leg was unrecognizable, but the other, I noticed, was missing a foot. Lo and behold, that was the boot I had walked past just moments before, foot still inside. Kinda creepy that in the dark I had managed to miss a body not 10 feet off the track I was walking on. I use my headlamp every time now.